I know that there are a lot of you that are much like me in this regard, that the idea of sitting still and reading a book for the second time is not on your agenda, right? Like if I've read the book once, I'm not going back to read it again. It's kind of that idea of like you watch a movie, like it has to be a really, really, really good movie to be like, hey, let's go rewatch that because like we already know the ending. And certainly when you're streaming something, if you've seen seasons 15 of your shows, you're not going to be like, yeah, let's go start from the beginning. Most of us don't like to sit still that long, and yet there's some really rich moments when we actually sit still, because some of you do enjoy rereading a book and going back and rewatching a movie and going back through a season. And in that space, you recognize that there were some things there that you should have pondered deeper the first time, but you completely missed it. Jonah has set his work up to help both of us. Those of us who don't like to reread something, Jonah actually resets it halfway through the book and said, hey, you don't have to start from the beginning. Let me just re-show you what's going on. And yet Jonah is pondering literature. He is doing something that allows us to slow down and, well, sit in some things. And so we're in week 3 of a 4-week fishing trip through the book of Jonah. And let me just tell you that today is going to be one of those days where you're going to throw your hook out in the lake and you're just going to let the bobbers sit there. And I'm going to ask you to just kind of keep an eye on your bobber. Not everybody else's bobber, your bobber. Because I believe as we walk through Jonah chapter 3, that there are going to be some things that are just directly for you. And when you see that bobber go under the water, your bobber, grab hold of that. Allow the Lord to take you there. Don't look to your left or look to your right. Just grab your fish and go. Because Jonah chapter 3 slows us down and starts to put some things in perspective for us that maybe we might have missed in chapter 1 and 2 and are projecting us into chapter 4. Jump in your Bibles to Jonah chapter 3. It's page 862 on the Bibles that are there in front of you. As you're jumping to Jonah chapter 3, page 862, let me remind you where we've been in fishing week number 1 and 2. We met Jonah, who was given a call from the Lord out of the identity that the Lord had given him, the calling and the mission before him to go to Nineveh. And, well, Jonah said, I'm not interested, God. I'm going to flee to Tarshish. And God met him in chapter 2 after he slowly drifted away and landed himself in a dark spiral that landed him in the bottom of the sea, graciously swallowed up by God by a big fish. They processed life a little bit, and God graciously vomited him out of that fish onto dry land. And Jonah's in that moment where he is now back on dry land and going to try again that which God has called him to. But before we hit that, I want to remind you where this comes from. Out of Matthew chapter 12, as a church, we're trying to listen to the teachings of Jesus and not just be learners, but be livers of what God has for us. That we would take the things that we learned from Jesus and we would put them into our lifestyles every day. And one of those teachings happens in Matthew chapter 12, and it points us to Jonah. It says this in 12, verse 38 through 41. Then some of the Pharisees and scribes answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. Don't you want to see that? Aren't you constantly like, God, just give me a sign and I'll obey it? But he answered them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. Don't just write yourself out of that statement because of the vivid language. But no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. As we look at this, you notice that it was Nineveh Jesus pointed to. He said it was those Ninevites who repented and turned. And you ought to pay attention to them to see the type of resurrection work that God can do. And, well, Jesus is saying, if God did resurrection work in the Ninevites that we're going to learn a lot more about here in just a little bit, how much greater of a work does God want to do in all of humanity based on what he has done through the person and the work of Jesus? As we jump into Jonah chapter 3, Jonah is pondering literature. You've noticed, if you've been reading and studying through this, that Jonah doesn't waste a syllable, a word, or a phrase. He's trying to have our full attention, and yet within his writing, he creates intentional gaps that don't add up so that it gives you space to think about, where do I fit within that reality? Some of you, today's going to be a gift because, well, several of us grew up on Jonah being a story that we learned about at Vacation Bible School or through Veggie Tales. And all we remember is this great fish swallowed this dude up and, well, vomited him out. And that's what we know about Jonah. And we've painted this study as if like, well, Jonah's this really cool kid's story. And maybe if an adult has to grab something from it, they could grab like, hey, you don't run from God's call on your life. And I would suggest if you actually read and ponder through Jonah, it is not a kid's story at all. It's way heavier than what you would read to your kid at bedtime. And I wonder if us just leaving that line out in the deep waters of our soul and watching the work that the Lord might do by sinking that bobber from time to time to grab our attention, I wonder if there's something that will happen in you individually and us collectively as we've gathered here today. Jonah chapter 3 starts this way. But can I take you to Jonah chapter 1? Look how verse 1 through 3 of chapter 1 sounds. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, a son of Amittai, saying, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it. For the evil has come up before me.' But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found his ship to go to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." That's how this book started. Now listen to the repetitive language and how chapter 3 starts. "Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time." Not a new book, not a new movie, not a new series, a continuation of the Lord's gracious work in Jonah's life. A second time saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you." It's the same mission. He doesn't abandon the mission. God doesn't do that. God calls him to the same mission. Verse 3, "So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. And now Nineveh was exceedingly great city, a 3 days journey in breadth." As we look at the way both of these start, I want you to take a note on a few things. Did you notice that in both places, a word of the Lord came to Jonah? And some of us are waiting for a word of the Lord to come to our life to give us purpose and calling and mission. And so it's like we look at Jonah and go, "Jonah, how come you didn't follow the sign of the Lord?" I want you to underline, word of the Lord came to. And leave out Jonah and look out at your bobber. Because the word of the Lord has already come to you. And the question is are you obeying the word of the Lord that has been graciously gifted to you? Let me just share a few things. Like, we've been walking in the teachings of Jesus and in the ways of Jesus. And let me just ask you how you're doing with the word of the Lord that has came to you. The word of the Lord has called us to resist the devil. Are we doing that? The word of the Lord has called us to love one another. Not those that we want to love. It calls us to love one another. It calls us to make disciples. That means where you live, work, and play, your first and foremost priority is to say, God, how do you want to help me reach lost people and help them find their likeness in Christ? We're to make disciples. The word has come to us and said, forgive. Don't just forgive. Forgive as you have been forgiven. If grace has been extended, you ought to be extending it. The word of the Lord has come and said, you ought to steward your resources in a way that honors God. The word of the Lord has come upon us over and over, and we just have to sit for just a second, look at our bobber and say, how are we doing in responding in obedience to the word of the Lord that has come upon us? Jonah's word of the Lord called him to go to Nineveh and to call them out against the evil that they were doing. We're going to double click on Nineveh like I promised over the past couple weeks in just a few minutes. But before we double click on it, let me just give you a quick little note here that you need to write for yourself. When God calls you to something, it likely won't be easy. All right, so if you're looking for an easy sign from the Lord, you're looking for the wrong sign. When God calls people to something, it is to transform them and to transform others. And so when God calls you to your Nineveh, it's probably going to be a hard place with hard people to have a hard conversation. And so if you're looking for easy, you're going to miss it. And Jonah has, in both sections, scene 1 and scene 2, he has a thing. Do I flee from this or do I fulfill this? As you look here and see this scene reset that we're going to journey on today and over next week, I will take you to some of Tim Keller's words. If you don't know Tim Keller, he's recently passed, but he is well known for his scholarship and his ministry to the church. And Tim Keller, when he's studying through Jonah, he says one of the best ways to kind of help understand what's going on here is to look at a much more familiar parable to most of us, which comes in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. And he says, look at the parable of the lost sons and the prodigal God. And as you look at that, you'll notice that the one son in external behavior flees from his father. He asks for all of his inheritance and he goes out and squanders it. And when he squanders that, he looks at his life exhausted and lonely. And he said, even my father's hired servants get treated better than the way that I'm living. Maybe I should return to see if my father will hire me back. And as he turns to go back to his father, as soon as his father sees him, his father runs toward him, which tells us something about the character of God. But there's also that other son who wasn't distant in external behavior to his father, but he was absolutely distant in his heart posture toward his father. He did the do's and don'ts that kept him in line with running the family operation, but he had resentment and bitterness and wounds and jealousy and tensions and questions and concerns. And all of this had been brewing. And so when the father returned his lost son and goes to him and says, do you want to celebrate for the lost one has come home? This brother looks internally and says, I'm in no condition to celebrate a redemptive work of God. And Tim Keller's trying to help us understand that Jonah fled from God, and many of us have done that in our life. But just because God's grace saves us in our darkest moments doesn't mean we will do, remember last week, that we will allow God to do the sanctifying work of grace in our internal life. And Keller points out that don't just look at Jonah's external disobedience, but rather take some time to ponder Jonah's internal disobedience. And some of us are watching that bobber and going, man, I look okay on the outside in my Christian life, but if you were to read my thoughts, my hearts, and my motives, it may not look as good as I would like it to look. I need the very grace of God to show up in these moments. I want to double click now on Nineveh, because we could be hard on Jonah. And we could say, hey, Jonah, God called you to Nineveh. Why didn't you go? Well, let me just take a minute. This is what history tells us about God calling Jonah to Nineveh. All right, this is what one scholar writes about this. He says, Assyrian history. All right, Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. Assyrian history is as gory and blood-curdling a history as we know. After capturing enemies, the Assyrians would typically cut off their legs and one arm, leaving the other arm and hand so they could shake the victim's hand in mockery as he was dying. They forced friends and family members to parade with the decapitated heads of their loved ones elevated on poles. They pulled out prisoners' tongues and stretched their bodies with ropes so that they could be flailed alive, their skins displayed on the city walls. They burned adolescents alive. Those who survived the destruction of their cities were fated to endure cruel and violent forms of slavery. The Assyrians have been called a terrorist state. Do you have a little deeper appreciation for why Jonah, when given a calling to go to Nineveh, was like, I'll take the vacation to Timbuktu over the short-term mission trip to Nineveh? I'm not trying to compare hard to hard, but sometimes I need my hard put in perspective. What's God calling to us that's hard? And have we seen him do incredibly redemptive things that are way harder than we could grasp or imagine? And will we lean into that when he calls us to our hard? Jonah, in going to Nineveh, understands there's a lot at stake. Let me just share with you. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, it gives kind of the qualifications of a prophet, all right? If a prophet is someone who speaks from the Lord for the Lord, and if you don't do that the way that you were called to do that, or you are an illegitimate prophet, you were worthy of death, okay? So when Jonah looks at his calling to Nineveh, he goes like, this is a death sentence. Either the Ninevites are going to kill me, or they're not going to respond to God, and I'm going to be worthy of being killed because, well, I didn't deliver on the calling that God placed on my life. And a follower of a prophet was responsible to take heed to what the prophet said, but if it didn't come to fulfillment in a reasonable amount of time, they were to disregard that prophet, and he was to be shamed and ridiculed. So Jonah's going, death? Or at minimum, shame and ridicule. And my guess is you feel that. I feel that. As a Christian, that God has called me to live counterculturally, sometimes I'm like, yeah, if I do that, God, like, how's that going to really shake out? I just want to ask you, kind of look out at your soul, that bobber that's hovering over the water, that hook that's deep within you, and just ask you this question. Who are your Ninevites? Who are your Ninevites? Because we are called to speak a word for the Lord from the Lord. All throughout the word, we are to be obedient to being salt and light. We are to be obedient in being truth and grace. We are to be obedient in loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you. We are called to make disciples of all nations. We are called to provide and equip the least, the lost, and the lonely. Who are your Ninevites? And are you obeying the identity, the calling, and the mission that the Lord has put before you? To help put this in some perspective, Tim Keller, when he had his preaching ministry, if I didn't already mention this, he preached out in New York City, so this gives it a little bit of context. When he had his preaching ministry, he preached through the book of Jonah twice. One time he preached through it exactly how I'm preaching through it, to equip the church to think about the abundant grace of God and its radical transformation in people, and that nobody is outside of that. We ought to be equipped and radical in the way that we go love our enemies, right? To equip you in that. That's one way, or one time in which he preached through Jonah. The second time that he preached through the book of Jonah was right after 9/11. to a church in New York City after the towers had fallen and the world was in complete chaos and the world was wondering, who should we point all the fingers at? Who should we hate? Who should we retaliate on? Who should we go kill? Who should hold account for all of this? And Tim Keller preached through the book of Jonah to remind us that everyone is created in the image of God. And so how we think about people, how we talk about people, how we talk to people, and how we treat people ought to be reflective of the abundant grace that God has expressed to us when we were still enemies with him. And I just wonder, who are my Ninevites? And how am I acting in light of the gracious work that God has done? How are we acting toward outsiders, people who think and act differently than us in light of what God has done for this community of believers? Jonah chapter 3, verse 4 through 5. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey, and he called out, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown." And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth from greatest of them to the least of them. As we look at this section, we're going to double click next week on Jonah's heart posture. We can't get to all of it at one time, so we'll double click next week on that. But this is one of those spaces where Jonah leaves a gap for you to think through. And I want to show you this so that you can think about it. Verse 4, it says, Jonah began to go into the city going a day's journey. You've already been told in verse 3 that, well, Nineveh is a 3 days journey in width, but Jonah only goes 1 day in. Another thing you might see here is that Jonah preaches a very short sermon. For something that is supposed to call people out and move them toward redemption, Jonah doesn't give them much. That'll speak to what's going on in Jonah's internal being next week. Let me just address right here my own weaknesses. Don't you wish I was like Jonah? When you look at this sermon that he preaches, did you count the words? God did a redemptive work and Jonah only preached 8 English words in this sermon. If you were to read your Hebrew Bible, he got it done in 5 words. I got some work to do. Can we cut a deal? I'll start working on 5 to 8 word sermons when we collectively start being radical in the way that we graciously extend God's grace to our enemies. When we start living so countercultural that people can't help but wonder what in the world is inside of those people. They use power in a completely different way than anybody else in the world seems to wield their power. God's grace is in this moment to the Ninevites. And some of you are sitting here going like, my bobber's starting to do some work here. If God wants to redeem, can redeem, and did redeem the Ninevites, then just maybe God's grace is powerful enough to change you, to transform you, to redeem you. Not just save you for all of eternity, but to use you right now in this moment in eternity. The Ninevites' response to what they heard based on God's grace was they believed God. They believed God. Notice the focus is on God, not on Jonah. Sometimes we put way too much focus on ourselves, and thus we don't trust God to go do hard things. Just keep the focus on God and follow him. Because the only thing that's going to save those hard situations is God himself. So just keep the focus where the focus needs to be. And these people repented. That word fast and sackcloth, it means they recognized who they were in light of who God is, and they put their dependence on him, and they humbled themselves and said, we are worthy of death. And so they put themselves in that place. And then do you notice that it's for everyone? It's both individual and communal, from the least to the greatest. Don't check out on me yet, because I think verses 6 through 9 may be the most important spot for some of your bobbers to start going underwater. Listen into verse 6 through 9. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe. Listen to the language of repentance here. The word reached the king of Nineveh. He arose from his throne. He got up off of his place of power, and he removed his robe. He took off the robe of power and covered himself with sackcloth, the robe of humility. And he sat in ashes to remind himself who he actually is without the redemptive work of God. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from his violence that is in his hands. Who knows? God may turn and relent and turn from his fierce anger so that we may not perish. The king's posture here matters. His response matters. His actions matter. Can I remind you what's at stake for him? He is in charge of the cruelest of the cruel Assyrian reputation. To step away from that is to jeopardize what everybody has always known this person or this seat or this responsibility for, and that is to steal, kill, and destroy anything that poses a threat on them. And I just have to wonder in my own life, and I'm going to ask you to project it into your life and think it through. Some of us minimize our leadership influence. Don't do that. You are absolutely a leader and you absolutely have influence. And when you start to recognize that you have leadership and you have influence, then it starts to, help you understand, I'm not capable of doing what I've been called to do. I need a better leader and influencer. And we don't try to do it on our own, but rather we yield to God and see what God can do in and through us. And I just wonder if your home would be transformed if you took the king's posture of leadership with your spouse and your children versus your current posture with your spouse and children. I wonder if our workplaces would look drastically different if we managed them and led them in humility and dependence upon God's grace. Maybe one way of articulating that is maybe if we walked into our places of leadership and influence and we didn't act like we have it all together, but rather admitted that we don't have it all together, but we're in pursuit of the one who does have it all together, people would say, how under such pressure do they seem to be kind to those who aren't kind back? I wonder here if Jonah is trying to help us understand that the prophet who was supposed to be like God, declaring the message of God, was the one who held on to bitter internal roots, while the king, who was supposed to be the person of power and dictate and kill anything that was in opposition to it, surrenders that power and says, maybe redemption would happen. Maybe redemption would happen if we led by the way God chooses to yield his power. And he does so graciously and redemptively. I wonder if some of us need to see that bobber and ask ourselves, where is our position of leadership? Where is our place of influence? And are we yielding that role and that responsibility in a way that is God-honoring, Jesus-following, and Spirit-filled? Look at verse 10. When God saw what he did, the king, and God sees because God is gracious and God is redemptive. God saw what he did, how they turned from their evil way. God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. You might want to circle, he did not do it, and write grace. If you haven't noticed yet, this whole work of Jonah is pointing you to who God is. He is gracious and redemptive and wants that for all people. As you look at your bobber right now and you think about the different times throughout this teaching in Jonah chapter 3 that it has gone under, I just want to remind you that the presence of the Lord is a big deal. And wherever your bobber went under, you're going to need the presence of the Lord to help you there. Some of you have some Ninevites that you need to go talk to. Some of you have some people who have hurt you that you need to forgive. Some of you have some things that need to be reconciled in your relationships, and those things aren't going to get better on your abilities or the other person's abilities. Those are going to need the very presence of God. The grace of God. And so can I just remind you, when I say the presence of God, sometimes that can be, well, what does that mean? The presence of God is connected primarily to two things: your desire for him and your dependence upon him. And so whenever you're looking for the presence of God or you need it to show up in your life, you need to ask yourself, am I desirous of what God is going to do here? And when God says, I'm going to do a redemptive work, it's going to be hard, with hard people, with hard conversations. Are you willing to follow him in dependence on him? If we want to experience the presence of God, we have to have desire for him and dependence upon him. And now let me remind you, tackle box number 1. The presence of God is a big deal. What you do with it and don't do with it reveals the deepest and the shallowest parts of your soul. And fishing hole number 2. In week 2's message, remember, sanctifying grace. Many people, superficial grace, many people, sacred grace. Few of us will go with God to a place of sanctifying grace where we allow him to transform us and transform a situation where we look back on it and say, only God. Jonah is having his only God moment. God, I'm far from who I want to be and need to be, but I was obedient to you, and only by your work did the Ninevites, those evil, horrendous, can't even fathom that God would want to love them in all that they have done wrong. Only God could turn their hardened hearts back to his sovereign power and redeem them. I think some of us, as humans, as leaders, as influencers, we focus far more on the results that we have no control over and spend far little to time focusing on what God is trying to do in us if we would desire him and depend on him. And so wherever your bobber has bobbed under today, will you allow the presence of God to transform you and lead you to be obedient in that space?